Welcome, everybody. We're here at MacArthur Park for a conversation called CIVIC Displaced. We want to explore how public parks here in LA County either create opportunities for use by communities of color, communities who've been historically denied access from some of these spaces, but also kind of look at some of those uses. Here in MacArthur Park, for example, in the 80s and 90s was a center of hip hop activity. There was Radiotron down the street. And so youth took the space over to come together, build community, but also create art. And in more recent times, the Levitt Pavilion has been a convener of various communities through music and the curation of musical artists. And so today, I'm here with Rosten Woo, Pamela, and Ms. Julia to have this conversation. And our moderator for today, Rosten Woo, I know from various circles talking about art and community engagement and how to build opportunities for community members to come in and have agency and a voice in our civic process.
Great. So I'll pull this down. Thanks, Joel. So my name is Rosten Woo, and I'm an artist and designer living in LA, and we're joined by Julia Bogany and Pamela Villaseñor. And maybe you guys can introduce yourselves briefly, and then we can talk a little about where we are right now and how you see it through your eyes when you see this space, what you see.
So I'm Julia Bogany, and I'm Tongva, and I was here 20 years ago when middle school had a vision for this park, and by now it's supposed to be like merry-go-rounds, kind of like a carnival, kind of like a family-oriented place, and I don't see none of that happen in 20 years.
I'm Pamela Villaseñor from the Fernandeño Tataviam Band of Mission Indians. This is not my people's homelands. This is the homelands of Julia's people. And so I'm honored to be invited here in their space today and to look at what is here. And I look at the park and I wonder, how have Indigenous peoples, her specific tribe and villages, been incorporated into this space?
That's great. And so maybe let's dive right into that. So Julia, I know you from that Civic Memory Task Force, and I know a piece of it that you were working on, and specifically was a city policy around land acknowledgement. And it seems like that's an appropriate way to sort of talk about where we are here and your thoughts on what is a land acknowledgement, what's it for, where does it head, where does it leave us?
Well, the land acknowledgement to me just helps stop that erasure of the people. And today, it's not about, people get scared when you say land acknowledgement because they think they want land. Where are we going to go? But it's not about that. It's about seeing us as human beings and having a place to go, having a place for our families to participate with the community. We're not trying to erase anyone, but we don't want to be erased either. So I think that's the biggest thing about the land acknowledgement, is acknowledging who we are.
And then how does that play out in the form of like a city policy around land acknowledgement? Like what does that do for helping create a space for people? Is that enough? Like how will that play out in a place like this, in creating the vision of like what you were talking about, what you don't see here?
I think because we haven't been part of the being at the table. I always say if we're not at the table, we're part of the menu and not part of the community engagement of talking together and having that unification of being together with groups, you know. So sometimes we get accused of stuff that we don't do, right? That's a problem that I'm having right now with Riverside, with all the toppling of statues. Somebody messed up a cross in Riverside and then blamed it at a park and blamed it on the Tataviam, and the Tongva. And I said, why would you think it was us? And they said, because it said something about Father Sarah. I said, well, do you understand Jesus is not on a cross, so it's not a Catholic cross? And so I think sometimes we get accused of things that we're not doing, and we don't get a chance to have a voice. And I think being on several a couple of us from each tribe, right? Being on different things and having a voice, that's what's important.
Maybe let's kind of zoom in on that idea of having a voice, and how do you get to have a voice, and who do you speak to? Something that I think really struck me about your work, Joel, in talking about actually taking down Father Serra statues, is the way that act seemed to really change the ability of the city and the county to hear a voice. So what are the things, I guess, and I'll ask this to each of you maybe across, like what are the things that you found effective in creating a voice for marginalized people in LA? Like what are the strategies that, and I guess if you could be as specific as possible, like something that you feel like you've done where you're like, oh, this really changed the way this conversation could play out.
Well, first, I do have to acknowledge that the work that I do is really informed by folks like Pamela and Miss Julia. Like, I'm texting them, calling them, and so I'm very mindful of how I move about with the work. But I think the most effective tool that has helped both with the Columbus statue and with the Serra statue was taking the conversation outside of the institution and into a community setting, creating those opportunities for community voices to be inserted into even the institutional process. With the LA County Department of Arts and Culture, at one point it boiled down to actually going to a commission meeting and in a way taking over that meeting. Like we asked, can we have some time to speak? But they didn't know that there was going to be 12 of us that were going to show up to talk, So we took them by surprise. And that changed the conversation. With the Serra statue, we knew that there had been multiple attempts to even just begin a process. And, for that, it became a more public action that needed to happen to then initiate that conversation. With that happening, it was also important to build relationships with the folks who have oversight over some of these decisions. The Department of Cultural Affairs, they're following us from yesterday. So, in these processes, it is important to build relationships with folks who might not necessarily agree with you or who might not understand the position that you're coming from. So creating relationships with folks at Department of Cultural Affairs, creating relationship with the folks who oversee parks and recs, and in some instances also with elected officials, not to ask permission about doing something, informing them, but also holding them accountable to protect the interests of the community. And I think that's been able to move the conversation to other spaces where it is more fruitful, it is much more informed by folks like Pamela and Miss Julia, and it's also driven by their perspectives first. So that's been really effective.
Great. What about
You know, there was this national survey, and it reported that 78% of all Americans would want to hear more stories about Native Americans. And in that same survey of all these Americans they asked, the majority said they don't believe that they have received historically accurate stories about Native Americans. And so I think most Americans would want accurate stories, and that if they were afforded these real opportunities in their education system by California Department of Education and the very different districts throughout the state, that if this state and those counties gave historically accurate and culturally competent narratives, that it'd be a very different discussion about Father Serra, about different colonizers and the true negative impacts that they had on Indigenous peoples and continue to have today. Because when I tell you that Native American youth have the highest rates of youth suicide across the country, you have to start begging the question of why. And when you look at the marginalization of our people with all that historical trauma, and then the continuation of that unacknowledgement of that trauma, and how that's manifested into the lack of policies and practices that build up wellness for these communities, then you start to connect the dots. You know, I have a 4-year-old, and we were doing a connect the dots picture. And you go from 1 to 2 to 3. And at the end, she was so surprised that there was this picture. And the way policy is very similar to that. It's all there. You just have to connect the dots to see the intersectionality between history and art and contemporary society. And then you understand. And I believe that community, whether they're indigenous or non-indigenous, will have those aha moments once we're able to collectively connect the dots.
So that's been my work. My work has been about healing my people. And so, of course, I met several artists that I work with, and now I'm getting carried away with them right now. So it's really great because every day when I speak to someone, they'll say, I saw you there, and and I told my students, and I think it's because some people aren't scared to hear the truth. And that's been the last 7 years for me with the mission, is telling the truth, challenging them that unless we tell the truth, we cannot heal and we can't go forward. So even though, like I say today, I have 4 children, 12 grandchildren, and 19 great-grands. The great-grands are all that are college age, are all going to college. But it's taken 5 generations to get that going, right? But what about when they turn 20 and they see the struggles of our people are still there? Will that change their minds, right? Because whatever I do with my great-granddaughter, I never let her know the stumbling blocks that you hit. I just go through them because I don't want her to see that. And I want her to be visible. I don't want her to see the invisibility. And for her, she's, we could say she's lucky or blessed or whichever, because I tell her at 13 I got that BIA number because my grandma fought for it. But she not only has a number, she can speak for it at 13, where we didn't, we knew we were Indian, but we didn't discuss it. And her, as a 15-year-old now, she started at 11 saying, I'm Native and I know it and I know my language and I can do it. And she, but what about when you start seeing the real reality is what scares me, the reality of knowing what the struggles that we go through.
So that's a great way to maybe turn the conversation, maybe back into the land, and asking sort of like, how do you make a landscape like this tell the truth, and what are the kind of the opportunities there, and what are the pitfalls? Like, Julia, when you were introducing yourself, you sort of mentioned, like, when you see this park, you sort of see all these things that didn't happen, that should have happened, ways that the community was consulted but then ignored. Are there ways to tell that story? Is that a good story to tell, or is that the kind of story that ends up discouraging people from trying to make the park better? What are the opportunities in a place like a park for telling the truth?
So I saw, when I arrived at the park, I saw several buildings that are just boarded up. Why can't we have a space to teach not only to our own children, but to the community who we are? What was here before? How do we go on? Because we didn't cease to exist, but we continued on. And how do we make that powerful? To empower other people to know who they are and to teach us who they are. Because that's the whole part of a relationship, is knowing about each other, right? And putting those buildings to use, or spaces.
Pamela, do you see spaces like this as being something that can be part of that truth-telling, or the ways we understand ourselves?
When it comes to creating a park, I think the ideal way to work with Indigenous peoples is to start with tribal consultation, which means having that meaningful dialogue with the tribal nation and asking them, what are your needs for this space and what do you envision for the future, including the use of your people? But so many parks here in Los Angeles County are past that. It's no longer about creating park space because it's about creating housing development. And so it's then being reflective on what exists and what could be if we just thought about the park differently. And I'll give you an example. Years ago, the tribe worked with the city of San Fernando to establish Rudy Ortega Senior Park, and it was a collaboration between the city and the tribe. And what it did was allow the opportunity for my tribe to be welcomed back after we were kicked out and made refugees from the city of San Fernando when our last village was taken from us. It's a whole state Supreme Court case. But in that whole creation of a park, we finally were able to have the discussion with city officials, with the community, so that they understood that we always had agency. We always fought for our land, for our homelands, for our community, for our lifeways, for our access to our trees, our access to our water, our responsibility to the other animals and plant life that were there. And that allowed for a great partnership. And we were able to think about the uses of a park different from just plain sports. While that is very important for so many communities, it doesn't tell the full need of what relationship to land is for Indigenous peoples. And that relationship for land is about our diet and having access to our plants. It's access to those plants that are part of ceremony, but it's also thinking about how do we tell our stories about who's here, what plants are we replanting, how are we reimagining use in this space. And so even today, my tribe, the Fernandeño Tatavium tribe, still uses that park for a lot of our community settings. We have our kids who go there for their art classes, or we have sunrise ceremonies. And so we're able to reimagine what it means to have a public park and what access looks like in those spaces.
Previously, Pamela, you spoke about that there exists no process for any tribal communities to access parks for ceremonies. And I remember when some of the youth from Semillas, a school in El Sereno that is primarily rooted in indigenous forms of education, they wanted to have their graduation there. And they couldn't. Grand Park has been a great space for folks, but again, the city's bureaucracy didn't allow for them to access that park in a not only in an equitable way, but an affordable way. Like the price just to have a graduation there was ridiculous, and I think that's something that both the city and the county have to reconsider when it comes to cultural practices and the uses of public space, where policy needs to change. And I know some of the work that you and Julia are doing. Hopefully, that's where the conversation goes, like policy wise, with that park next to Olvera Street or Placito Olvera. The conversation has shifted as well too with the removal of the statue. One of Julia's nieces, Kimberly Morales Johnson, asked like, why isn't there any representation of the Tongva community here at Olvera? Why can't we have a Tongva museum? And although museum is an idea that needs to also kind of get unpacked, and maybe a learning center or something else that can do a better job of telling that story, but it's opened up an opportunity to talk about reclaiming land and how to give stewardship of city property, supposedly city property, the notion that I think that they own it, to the community, to their community. I think that's the work that now, because of monuments and the interrogation of civic space, public space, has allowed for those conversations to start to really happen at a deep level. But I don't know if you want to talk about kind of some of the work that your tribe has done up in in your community around that.
Thank you for bringing that up, Joel. So I would say that in 2018, I approached the county to get a permit to gather acorns as part of some of our community festivals and our traditional practices. And they basically called me back and the city and said, we don't have a process for Indigenous people, for your tribes to get a special permit for special use, even though a very similar permit exists for forestry and for the state of California. And so it leads to the question of, what has the city and county been doing for the last century in terms of acknowledging the needs of Indigenous peoples? Let's be honest. Nobody wants to talk about returning land to tribes, but I'll say it, #land back. Why can't we have land back? And so my tribe developed the Tatavium Land Conservancy for that very purpose, is to move land into our own conservancy for our future use, for our future generation. And we have a big project coming up where we are acquiring lands in our homelands, actually many acres of it, and now we have to have those conversations about what is environmental stewardship from an ancestral lens, from an indigenous framework, and how do we make sure that we're just not perpetuating status quo of what colonizers have put into place in terms of access, in terms to landscape and connection to land. So if we're talking about creation of permits and changing policies and activating people, there also has to be building up of an infrastructure. And in this case, land conservancy that is of indigenous creation and indigenous led by our own community.
In Curuanga Springs in Santa Monica. I'm the president there, and it's the only piece of land that has not been touched. Sits next to University High School. Has one little building there, and I call it a nature center because I think that artifacts need to stay with family, and it's a nature center because there's things like a museum might have, but it's things that we make today. And if I can't find something I can make, then I find that person that can make it. So that it's not an artifact, right? But a replica. But we have natural spring waters there. And I lease the grounds for $1 a year. But I can only be there when school's in session. I cannot be there on the weekends and because nobody can use the restrooms because it's connected to the school. So how do you keep the land? So I've learned that it's better to say, I'm sorry, than it is to say, can I? So we planted 20 trees, fruit trees, and we have watermelons growing and cantaloupes and community coming. It's like, sorry, you didn't say I couldn't do it, you know, but that you just kind of got to really push to get what you want done. But yet we have like 246 gallons of water going a day to the ocean. So we put up a solar panel, and it waters the entire land right there. But constantly fighting for there not to be a parking lot for those apartments, right?
I mean, so I keep on returning to this kind of like image still about this, 20 years ago, sort of this idea of like consultation, getting people to like give their ideas and be part of something, but then the city or the state not really having the wherewithal or the interest in like actually seeing that vision through. And so you're talking about like a land conservancy, like this is something that really allows, real power. Like you have control of this land. And so I'm just curious if are there other strategies, the one is obviously you presumably you have to buy the land, right, to form the land conservancy, which is a painstaking years and years and years long process. So when we're talking about, how do we move from something that's sort of like a token, a land acknowledgement, to something where it's like we have real control, and there's sort of this idea of we just do it. We don't worry about the legality, which I think is. But so, what are the other strategies within there? Is there something else that is a policy that seems like we're heading towards what we talk about when we talk about land back? Is there a strategy like that's incremental towards that, or does it have to be like on and off? Or in between, like what does it look like to imagine how that really happens?
So the process of getting land back really is one about intersectionality. It's everything all at once, right? Indigenous peoples live in a contemporary context. We don't get to pick and choose what's important to us. It's all important. Mental health is important, education for our young ones, services for our elders, access to our traditional foods that then connects back to our physiological health. And by the way, we have some of the highest rates of diabetes, and a lot of that is tied back to not just historical trauma and impact on the body, but the keeping of our traditional diets from us. And so all of this work really does need to be intersectional and address a lot of things at once. So when we're talking about having land back for a conservancy, we're talking about environmental issues and the legal infrastructure to get there. And then, like you're saying, the moving land into conservancy. Who's paying for that? What is the obligation for a colonizing nation to give land back? But on top of that, it's how do we sustain it? So it's one thing to get land, but who pays the property taxes? Who does the maintenance and the upkeep? Well, my tribe got creative. We created an elders back to work program because there are a lot of elders who are living past their pensions. And so these elders are now back at work. And you know what work they wanted to do in their second or third careers? They want to work outside. And so they're the ones who do the maintenance of Rudy Ortega Senior Park in the city of San Fernando. They maintain our traditional plants, they maintain all the pathways. And so it's getting creative about what we already have and rethinking how do we indigenize that? How do we change the narrative and the scope of work so that it works for our tribal community and it's welcoming to even the non-tribal community. You know, my tribe has a really big heart. We don't have much, but a lot of our people are very humble and they're willing to share and invite people outside of our community into our spaces. And I think there's a beauty in that connection with other people, just on a human to human connection. So when we're talking about what do public spaces look like, I think it starts with that first connection with someone and having a conversation and understanding. You know, one of my leaders made a joke once, and he said, you know, we should just have a hug committee where all we do is meet and give hugs to people, whatever the topic is. And I started laughing and I said, that's sort of genius. Because imagine if we started these really polarizing conversations that everyone is forced to give a hug to one another. I think that human connection would really change maybe the progression of where it might go if it wasn't for starting this as an act of love.
So with the saying I'm sorry, so now I sell it to them. Back to the school, right? Now I say, I want to do an environmental school. I'm going to show how we survived on this land. On this little plot of land that is there, that's never been touched besides that one little building, we're going to show you how we teach environmental education by using our hands and not corporately.
For anyone here, when we think about this place where we are right now, what pathways do we see for what these places could become? How do we indigenize these places or Grand Park, these other places that were sort of like in the center of the city? Is there a path? Is that something that's possible here?
Something that has been, I don't know, top of mind when it comes to the use of parks. I think back to Chicano Park down in San Diego. So it's a space that it got converted into a park. It's underneath a freeway overpass, a freeway that was built and divided a community, similar to here in LA, right? And the community fought for this space because they didn't have any open space to gather, to commune, or to even just go outside. And so they took over this space, painted murals all over the underpass on the pillars. But the one important thing they did before any of that happened was they came together. The existing community there, the tribal nations down there, the Kumeyaay, and they formed this, they call it the steering committee, the Chicano Park Steering Committee. And together they created a charter for the park. This is how this park is going to be used. These are our values. And the city adopted those uses. So even till today, 40 something years later, that charter is what guides the use of the park. And I think back, like, what would it be like if every park here had a charter where, you know, unsheltered folks are not seen as a nuisance, but are seen as stakeholders in the park, in the maintenance of the park. The park by where I live in East LA, at night you go there and you see encampments, you see tents and unsheltered folks living there. And this is, you know, tucked in between the sheriff's station and the courthouse. But you go back in the morning and all that's disappeared. And those same folks who were there sleeping overnight, you'll see them out there cleaning the park, you know, participating in the use of the park. They see themselves as stakeholders. This is their community. The community there that goes and, you know, exercises. I go and walk my dog there. We all see each other. We acknowledge each other. We don't like look away like, oh, there's an unsheltered person. Like, we acknowledge each other. And I think it is that, like what Pamela mentioned, in that seeing one another, it changes the dynamic of a space. For that to happen, I imagine that the community had to have really pushed hard. When I grew up, that park was like, I needed to like just speed on through because it was like, you know, gang territory in between different neighborhoods. Just get through there quickly. And now you go back there and it's much more vibrant. It's useful. They have farmers markets there. So the community took ownership over that space. And then from that, the powers that be had to, I guess hold a press conference and say like, we're going to do this now. But the plan and the use had already been created by the community. I think for us here, very much like Julia and Pamela are sharing, I think we create the use of it and then push and encourage city officials to just adopt it and create policy so that it becomes best practices around how you bring in community, welcome community, and embrace one another. I think that example of Chicano Park is super helpful.